Welcome to IVF This, episode 84, The What If Game. Welcome to IVF This. I'm your host, Emily Ginn. After 10 years of primary and secondary infertility due to both male and female factor infertility, I am now the mother to 3 beautiful miracles. I am married to my favorite person in the world. I'm a social worker, a life coach, and an IVF warrior. I'm here to teach you how to manage your mind and emotions during your IVF journey, to break free from anxiety and regain control of your life, even in the midst of infertility. I'm going to teach you how to say IVF this to how we think about, talk about, and experience infertility. Let's go. Hello, my beautiful friends. I hope you are all having a wonderful, wonderful week whenever you're listening to this. Now, before we get started, I want to let you know that I've started opening up my schedule a little bit more. I have some listeners in Australia and New Zealand that reached out to me about some appointment times because the time difference is so vast that when I had openings, it would be like overnight for them. So for my wonderful Aussie and Kiwi listeners, I put a few days of the week that might work better for y'all. So I hope you find that. If anyone listening has attempted to schedule an appointment with me but didn't really find a time that worked for their schedule, please send me an email or a DM and let me know. I am more than happy to see if we can figure out a time. So you can always email me at hello@ivfthiscoaching.com, or you can DM me on either Facebook or Instagram. My handle is ivfthiscoaching. Now, I'm really excited to talk to you today about a little game that our brain likes to play, and I have a sneaking suspicion that your brain likes to do this too, and we'll call it the What If game. It is a game of scenarios and that are by and large not super fun, right? Sometimes fun stuff, but mostly it's a game of like Stephen King-esque scenarios. Most of the scenarios are like every possible terrible thing that could happen to either me or the people that I love, right? And I'm sure that's the same for you. My brain is so damn creative and extremely vivid when it wants to create terrible things. And this is probably true for you too. So let's just level set things first off. This is completely normal. This is literally what our brains do. The knee-jerk reaction when we start to play the what if game is that we start to feel like there is this scenario that is true or will somehow become true. So we either think that we need to believe what our brain is telling us or that there is something wrong with us when our brain starts to do this. Neither of those things are true. I spend a lot of time doing thought work and managing my mind, and this still happens to me on a regular basis. The most experienced and seasoned coaches and individuals in thought work still do this. It is not a character deficit. It is the nature of having a human brain. That's why we call it managing your brain. No control, just management. Now, that's not to say that once you get familiar and skilled at thought work that the severity of the freakouts don't happen when your brain is playing this game, or that doesn't decrease, because it will. But it's like a perpetual thing that you're always working on rather than what we expect, which is like a one and done sort of situation. I love it when my clients say that they just want to get rid of their negative thoughts and feel better. But do you know what you would get in that scenario? You would be a freaking Stepford wife, like this robot of a person that doesn't have any emotions. And I don't know about you, but I like to feel the feelings, right? I want to feel my emotions, even the uncomfortable, not so great ones. Our brains are wired towards negativity. It's called the negativity bias. I did a whole podcast on this like a year or so ago. And it's this bend toward the negative, which is how our brain thinks it's protecting us. Your brain is like, well, if I show you all of the terrible things that could happen, we will somehow be prepared for it when it does. It's like a protective mechanism. But that's just what your brain is like. It prefers to imagine sad or scary things because it wants to protect you, and it thinks that that's what it's doing. That's why it subjects you to this what if game. The problem is most of us don't understand it's a game. So it's like your brain is running all of these terrible scenarios imagined in anticipation of something terrible happening because your brain thinks it's a reasonable way to kind of plan or prepare you for something like that to come to pass. So your brain is playing like a role-playing game in what it thinks is like the comfort and safety of your brain. But let me ask you this. When you play the what if game, Do you feel safe and comfortable? Probably not, or probably not a lot of the time, right? And that's because we interpret this game happening inside of our brains as a reasonable and logical prediction of the future. And since the game usually entails some pretty scary stuff, we interpret that future for ourselves to be scary. We take the scenarios to mean that we can predict the future instead of it just being made up, that's what's happening in our brain. It's all imagined. It's all made up. But we don't realize it. We think these things are actually going to happen. Now, some of them might, but I'm just saying that we think that we're predicting the future, but we're not. Your primitive brain especially does not know the difference between what is really happening and what we're only imagining or seeing in our head. This is kind of why people like scary movies, because they get legitimately scared, but it's on screen. It's on a screen and you're completely safe. But your primitive brain has evolved long before technology, so it really doesn't understand that there is a difference. So the first and most important step is to remind yourself that it's just a game your brain is playing. It's not right, it's not wrong, it's not that your brain is evil or that it's working against you or that it hates you. It's quite the opposite. Your brain thinks it's helping you. So start with reminding yourself that this is just, in fact, a game. In that moment when you're watching the whatever scenario the game is offering, most of the time, nothing is happening to you right then. So when the game starts happening, you can notice that your body is physically safe, that you are, in fact, imagining that it's not actually happening to you or around you. Look around the room, fix your eyes on something that is there, feel your feet on the floor, and breathe. When you imagine getting the phone call from the clinic that starts with, "I'm so sorry, but," remind yourself that you're not on the phone and that hasn't happened. You picture yourself lying on the exam table for the egg retrieval and you're wide awake, but you can't speak or you can't move and you can feel everything. Remind yourself that you're not there, that you're physically safe. I've talked a lot about this in the last few weeks, but we are living in a time when we have unrealistic expectations for how much we can control our lives and how smoothly and peacefully that everything should go. So we've bought into this lie that what's around us determines how we're going to feel, right? Which is kind of the opposite of what I teach. But since humans existed, they have been living in uncertain times and having to learn how to feel safe and grounded wherever they are. And it's something that a lot of meditative and religious traditions focus on for a reason. So you can learn to do this too. Once you've gotten a little bit of grounding, there are two tools that we use for the What If game to help neutralize its hold over you. And in a funny way, they're kind of like opposites, but they do work together. You don't have to use them in order. Some of you will need to do both. Some of you can skip the first one and go straight to the second one. I would suggest that you don't stop at the first one. It'll make sense when I explain them to you, but this is just kind of an alert. Don't stop at the first one if you're doing both of them. You can do 1 and 2, or you can just do 2, but don't do 1 by itself. I'll explain why. So the first thing you want to do is just go there. When your brain is showing you all of the horribles, the tendency is to look away or distract yourself or get totally sucked in like it's this fully immersive virtual reality experience in your brain. What your brain is not doing in that moment is actually using your prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain that can solve problems. When you indulge in the what if game, you don't have access to that prefrontal cortex, which is why grounding yourself is super important. It's a way to take back the reins in your brain. Before that, your primitive brain is like in the driver's seat, but is a really shitty driver. So you need to take back control of the car. So what I see happening so much in my clients, and absolutely in myself, I will say, is that my brain will go to the worst case scenario, but then it stops and watches it play like a passive movie that we can only view. And I think I've said this on the podcast before, but your brain will always stop at what it thinks is the scariest thing and just repeat that over and over and over, and maybe add different flavors of horrible, but the cycle will just keep continue going and going and going. That's what we call spiraling, right? And I love to think of it this way. When you're watching a horror film on TV, you can't intervene. No matter how many times you yell at the screen, you can't intervene. But when you're in your own brain and it's your own life, you can. So if you're going there, go all the way there. Say, okay, brain, let's see what does happen. That worst case scenario, now that I'm in the worst case scenario, what would I do? How would I handle it? How would I want to think and feel and act? What would I do if I was there? What would I do if I got that phone call? If I'm laying on that exam table, how would I take care of myself? Many of us get paralyzed in the face of this imaginary crisis, even though a lot of us are actually pretty good at making decisions and coping in a real crisis. So you got to bring that part of your brain online, that part of your brain that would actually analyze a real life crisis and decide what to do. You need to lean into that. Use that on your imagined crisis. One of the big problems with managing our thoughts around IVF and infertility is that the vast majority of people are totally safe and physically fine right now. There aren't any actions or additional actions that they need to take. If you're waiting for your period to come, waiting for a cycle to start, trying to conceive spontaneously between cycles, whatever it is. So you're just experiencing this predicted crisis in your brain, but without thinking through whatever actions they would actually take to take care of yourself should that thing happen. When you're actually experiencing a crisis, you're dealing with it. You're trying to get the care you need. Maybe you're making some hard decisions, but you're actually interacting with it, not just passively watching or imagining it happen. This is one of the biggest things that I focus on with my clients is reminding them that they have survived everything that has happened to them in their lives. That doesn't mean that there wasn't trauma or pain or anything like that, but it does mean that they have been put in situations where they have had to make decisions and not gotten something that they've really hoped for, that they felt devastated, that they felt pain and they felt grief, and they figured it out. Humans are incredibly resilient. And so are you. When we are playing the what if game, we constantly tell ourselves that we don't know what we would do, but it's not true. You do know. You just aren't allowing yourself to get to a place where you can consciously decide and think that through, which is why the grounding and these steps are so important. We do have internal and external resources, all of us. We can figure out what to do, how to cope with whatever happens. It doesn't mean we're going to love it. It doesn't even mean we're going to get the outcome that we want. But we can trust ourselves to do the next best thing, whatever that happens to be. When my brain presents me with a crisis, I think through what I would actually do, not just watch it happen in a vision of some perceived future where I can't apparently think, reason, talk, or do anything. I want to actually go there and be like, okay, if this did happen, what do I want to think? How do I want to feel? What actions do I want to take? Again, knowing I can't completely control the outcome, but you will be amazed how different it feels to just imagine yourself as a passive victim and to imagine yourself showing up the best you can, taking whatever actions you take. Even though you know you can't completely control the outcome, it feels completely different, those two different scenarios. So take it all the way and actually have your brain solve the problem rather than just watch this horror show happening and assume you wouldn't take any action or that you wouldn't be able to handle it or that you would do nothing and that you would just give up and lay in the street and die. It's why one of the greatest sources of peace for me is the thought I trust myself to handle whatever happens when the time comes. I've handled hard things before and I'll do it again. That is part of the human experience. My teacher says being a human is not supposed to be a vacation, which is annoying, but it's true. And that does include the ultimate things that we fear. Things like illnesses, death of loved ones, even ourselves, things like that. Those are inevitable parts of life. And we have to handle them at some point, no matter what. So once you've done that, once you've actually taken it to the worst case scenario, but played it out, think about how you would want to think and feel and act and show up, realizing that you can trust yourself to take the next best action. So now you're ready for step 2, and let's turn it around, and we're going to play a different game. This is what I like to call the game of possibilities, or the possibilities game, whatever you want to call it. Because left to its own devices, our brain will only create the what if game of horribles. But horrible outcomes aren't the only outcomes that can ever happen. And horrible imaginings aren't the only thing that we can ever imagine. It's not the only thing available to us. So it's important to give your brain a better project, which is why the possibilities game is so important. To me, possibility has always seemed kind of inherently positive if I don't attach anything negative to it. So like the possibilities game, the truth is that we don't know the future and we spend so much time imagining a negative version of it. And you have to be wise to your brain. Like you have to catch it on its BS. A lot of us were doing this well before infertility and IVF. For most of us, this is not the first time that our brain has decided to fixate on all the horrible things that could happen. But let's be real, that because our brains like to pretend that it's totally wasn't like this before, right? And this is now the really serious, true thing that's going to happen, that you absolutely need to listen to this. No, your brain was like this before. We have always spent a lot of time imagining negative outcomes. So it's important to try to use your brain on purpose to imagine possibilities. Sometimes I call this equal airtime. You're spending an equal amount of time hearing your brain out. All of the horrible things, all of the terrible things that your brain is trying to prepare you for, because that's its job. And then you're going to dedicate an equal amount of possibility, of time towards those possibilities. And it doesn't have to only be rainbows and flowers and daisies and sunshine, whatever, right? We're not forcing gratitude or positivity. The possibilities game can absolutely be that. If it's possible, I will get pregnant the next cycle or whatever, but it doesn't have to be. It could be something like, if this round doesn't work, I can have that really expensive bottle of wine that I've been saving, or I'll go out and buy myself a cupcake. Like, I don't want you to get caught up in it has to be the happiest of all possibilities. That might not be available to you right now. Maybe it's planning a trip with your partner or your family. Maybe it's going to a concert. Maybe it's just taking a nice, long, hot bath. If when playing the possibilities game, you find yourself feeling terrible, then those don't really feel like possibilities, right? And there's nothing wrong with that. Switch to something that feels more realistic, more neutral, more attainable. You guys know that I strongly advocate for incrementalism because that's not something that really exists in our culture. We want it to be all the way, balls to the wall, amazing all the time. But that's not how life works. We feel better when we make small tweaks, little incremental changes to take care of ourselves and to love ourselves. We get overwhelmed and stop when we try to do all of the things that we think we're supposed to do. So we're not going to do any of that. The biggest lie your brain tells you is that when an external circumstance suddenly changes, everything is different and terrible in some new, real way. That's probably something you confronted or are still confronting with infertility. But it's all part of the human existence. It's all part of the human experience. Every circumstance humans have ever experienced, it's all part of the package. There's always suffering and illness and death in the world. And there's always beauty, joy, and birth in the world. Always. There's always both. So you have to direct your brain to spend some time imagining the game of possibilities. What if you're closer to your friends and family after this? What if you show up differently, in every way? Because in this experience, your empathy and compassion for yourself has grown tremendously. What if you get inspired to create the life that you really want and you've been on autopilot? What if it shakes up your relationships in a way that needed to happen? What if there's meaning or wisdom to be gained from going through this process? And there doesn't have to be answers to these questions. I know that if I hopped in a time machine and went back 8 years and someone asked me if there was wisdom and growth in this opportunity, I probably would have been like, F off, like F all the way off. Not all of these questions are going to be for you or for this particular part of your journey, and that's okay. I'm just trying to help you generate some ideas of those possibilities. Sometimes future possibilities, like distant future possibilities, aren't really available to you, especially if the grief and pain is really fresh. Then I'd stick to this one question. What is the most loving thing I can do for myself right now? And see all the possibilities that your brain can come up with. Something that's just like, what's the next best step I can take? Sometimes focusing on the next immediate thing is the best thing you can do for yourself. And then the next, and then the next. One at a time, while you love yourself all the way through it, my friends, because that is the most important thing. Okay, that is what I have for you today. If you need some help with anything I talked about today, schedule a mini session and we can talk about it. We can play the what if game and the possibilities game together. We can walk through it together so you don't have to do it alone. You can do this. You can schedule the mini session by going to my website, www.ivfthiscoaching.com, or go to my social media bios and click on the links, either Facebook or Instagram. There's a link for mini session. So I hope to see you soon. Have a great week, my beautiful friends, and I will talk to you soon. Bye-bye. Thank you for listening to this week's episode of IVF This. If you like what you've heard, click subscribe and follow to make sure you don't miss an episode. And if you want to learn more, head over to www.ivfthiscoaching.com to learn how to work together.